Welcome back to another Boxscore Geeks show. As promised from last week, we will be discussing the NCAA, in part also its racial aspects. This was a curveball I threw Arturo, who was obviously on this show last week. At the very, very end of the podcast, he agreed to be on. We are in super good luck in that Jonathan. Let me get you. I'm going to screw up your last name. Is it Weiler or Wheeler?
Weiler is correct.
Weiler. Jonathan Weiler from the ESPN Watch, because somebody else has to, has agreed to be on the podcast, which, an amazing get on our part. I would have assumed someone in North Carolina in the middle of March would not have time this week to come on a podcast, but amazingly you do.
Well, UNC doesn't play its first game till tomorrow night. So.
Okay. That makes sense. And then I was going to say, we're actually going to be bashing the NCAA a fair bit on this podcast, but I just wanted to shout this out. If you look at Arturo Galletti's cheater sheet, if you didn't get a chance to use it, joke's on you, but it was on the site with ample time before the bracket started. Arturo may have a screencast that says Harvard's going to win it all. Don't read the words before it or after it. Just leave those out. Just don't look at that. Arturo said Harvard was going to win it all.
All I'm going to say is I think I'm the only Boxscore geek that can say that their alma mater actually has a non-trivial chance at winning the NCAA. So, hey,
All right. So moving on, we're going to be jumping into the NCAA, racial issues, the issue of paying workers. These have been major topics, particularly on the ESPN Watch. And I was going to say, Jonathan, you had a great piece recently up, I think, called The Greatest Minor League System. I'm going to let you start us off a little just on the legality and how this all kind of came about and your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, so I'll just very quickly say the piece I wrote yesterday, The Greatest Minor League System, was Larry Brown had made that comment about the NCAA last week, and I just looked at Bruce Pearl, who, as you guys know, was just hired by Auburn for $15 million to see how many players he sent to the NBA in his 10 years as a Division I coach before, up to now. And the answer is basically nobody. And I think that just gets into a bigger question about how self-serving this enterprise is for the coaches who are making millions, exploiting the players' labor, and it is labor, which we're going to get into here. And there's a real question how much the players themselves really benefit from being forced to go to college because they can't go directly to the NBA, or there isn't a viable minor league, and the NBA is now trying to make them stay one more year in college than is currently the case. So I think all of those things, that gap between the beneficiaries of this enterprise, on the one hand, the coaches, the boosters, the commercial enterprises, the ADs, and on the other hand, the players who make it go. That gap is just, it's enormous, and it's obscene, really.
And then, like before the show, we were definitely talking about this. And Arturo, it's so awesome to talk to people that are just so knowledgeable about the history of this. You guys fill in gaps I don't know, but like, you were bringing up the absurdity of how the student athlete just came to be, and I think all of us love the documentary Schooled, which talks even more about that.
Well, I think the history of the NCAA is interesting. I think we're going to put some pieces around this which will kind of explain it, and I recommend it's Travis Branch, right? Travis Branch piece, which is great. Taylor Branch, which outlaws the history. I think the thing is to keep in mind, like basically the NCAA came about because there was too much violence in football. There were too many deaths, and they needed a rules committee, and it was basically toothless for a while. But really, then they had to come up with the fiction of the student athlete to protect themselves from workman's compensation. And really, it's really interesting because the players are not students and they're not athletes, right? Because if they were students, they'd be covered under the responsibility of the university to protect their students. If they were athletes, then their implication is they are part of an enterprise, and they're kind of working for the university and providing a service, and they're neither. They're student athletes, so they don't fall into the typical kind of workman's comp laws that kind of apply. And there's some famous cases around that, but I won't get into it. But the whole fiction is kind of how do we kind of exploit this and reduce? Everything is about reducing liability for the schools and for the NCAA and maximizing profit, right? And it's a really kind of interesting exercise that they've come up with to kind of get into such a place where like we have all these people who are willing to work for free, basically, because we really have no choice.
And I think Jonathan, you had done a piece. I seem to recall. I loved your logic, which was the schools say they're not athletes, and you go, why? And it's because they say they're not athletes. I think you've pointed out the absurdity of this on more than one occasion.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most direct absurdity here is the claim that the schools make that the student athletes, at some point I said we should all, right-minded people should stop using that phrase because it is a propaganda phrase, but that the student athletes are students first. And when it comes to big-time college football and college basketball, we know that's not true. They've been brought to campus for one reason and one reason only, and it's to play football and it's to play basketball.
Yeah, and I think. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
I was going to say basically we have to kind of make a distinction in a way because I think basketball players are being exploited, and I think football players are being violently exploited because I do think that the cost. Like there's basketball where like they're making more profit and they're not paying you, and there's football where basically they're taking years off your life and you're not getting compensated at all. So there's a degree, right? So basically it's I'm gonna make comparisons because get me into trouble. So basically the basketball players are like the house slaves, and the football players are the slaves out in the field.
And I mean, like I said, I've noticed this language makes people uncomfortable. A book I've really liked is $40 Million Slaves. And every time I bring that up, people say, the argument I kind of get back, which I find absurd when we're talking levels of absurdity, is, well, slavery in the United States was much, much worse. That seems to be the only defense. It's you cannot use the word slave in regards to college athlete because we've done worse in the past, which to me is absurd. But I do think that there definitely is that part there, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I was curious on both of your takes because we're talking the legality. There were two cases in the 1970s or near that time. The Hayward case with the ABA to get players to play young, and then the Oscar Robertson case, which basically got rid of free agency or restricted free agency.
Creative free agency.
Oh, yeah.
Creative free agency.
Okay. Created. It got rid of by restricted free agency. I meant like the Major League Baseball's definition of like, you're restricted in that you can never leave. What do you I'll let Jonathan hop in first because Arturo had class. What happened between the 70s where it looked like there was a progression in movement for, player rights, including student athletes, right? The ABA notoriously started targeting college players to now where, they're trying to get it pushed up to 2 years.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, so the Hayward case was in the early 1970s, and there's a distinction here. I'm going to try to avoid being too pedantic between a norm and a kind of legality. So the door was open for players to go actually straight from high school to the pros. Moses Malone did it in 1974. I've got friends who are University of Maryland fans. He was supposed to go play ball at Maryland. They thought they were going to win 4 national championships in a row, and he hopped straight to the ABA. So, but then only a couple of other people, I think Bill Willoughby was one, and Sean Kemp was another, who essentially didn't play any college ball. But there was nothing stopping players from going straight to the pros. It didn't occur to most people for about 20 years until Kevin Garnett decided to go straight to the pros in 1995, and then there was a flood of guys who went straight to the NBA over the next decade or so. And then essentially I think what happened was David Stern got the union to agree to an age restriction. And that's part of the complication. I mean, there's the legality of banning guys who are 18 from coming to the league, but once the issue is collectively bargained with the union, it makes it easier for the league to impose the ban. And so there is an interesting story there too about, I think, the Players Association kind of selling the younger guys down the river a little bit.
Well, it's their incentive is to, I mean, if you look at the average NBA career, it takes 6 years, and there's the fun math is there's 60 draft guys coming in, 360 slots. You do the math, right? So basically, every draft kind of replaces 60 players. So it's in the player's incentive to kind of limit and put restrictions on the guys who are not member of the union. So like the higher the age limit, the longer your career is going to be if you're an NBA vet. I think the one point which is historical, which is important, is the reason that case happens is because for that period where you have the ABA and the NBA, the basketball was not a monopoly, right? So basically you had two competing entities, and like that's why they were competing against each other for the contracts. And in essence, there's nothing stopping a team from saying, I want to sign that player, other than kind of the gentleman's agreement in the room where all the owners are going to abide by the rules of the NBA. But when you have two competing enterprises, that's why that case happens. And I think kind of one thing to keep in mind is basketball, historically, the basketball players union is probably the weakest of all the major sports unions. Probably hockey's weaker, but I think of the major sports, that's a really weak one. And really, they haven't taken advantage. And again, the NBA kind of, what they ended up doing is they act as a monopoly to kind of prevent all the owners from going out and directly hiring a player. There's nothing really preventing it legally. If like tomorrow the Lakers wanted to go out and sign the best college player in college and offer him a contract, honestly, under the terms of that decision, they could, except they couldn't because they don't want to break the monopoly, or they don't want to break the agreements that they have with the other owners, because it would be a competitive disadvantage to them, right? So it's a really interesting kind of case, and this only works because like the major sports all have like antitrust exemptions, which means they can act in a way that is against the general rule of law. So it's kind of an interesting artifice that we let the sports act in such a way.
And Jonathan, something really interesting you came out with, I seem to recall, was pointing out the success of high school players versus college players. And I believe it was you did like number of years in college and, looked at different success rates. And just an interesting perspective on that, right after the door was shut on high school athletes entering the NBA, the 2007 through 2009 finals were all led by a star that had entered the league direct from high school. And I think your point to that, and again, we'll talk more about that later, but I think you had made the point that, high school players have clearly shown they can play at the top level, or at least get to that top level. There's nothing keeping their development.
Well, and I just want to add one quick thing about that too, because, I mean, and I'm not the only one to point this out, the LeBron James and the Kevin Garnett's and the Dwight Howards of the world, who obviously did just fine going straight to the NBA. And then you hear people who cite counterexamples like Kwame Brown. But the point, of course, is that nobody's saying that everybody should go straight from high school to the NBA, right? The question is just whether can you really viably and credibly argue that it's impossible for a high school player to go straight to the NBA and succeed? Because that's what a ban means. And we know that's not true. So there's no doubt that even if the age limit were 18, most guys wouldn't go straight to the NBA because they wouldn't make it. But some obviously would.
I think the ban, the age restriction is there basically to protect players, to protect the owners from themselves. And I think what they're trying to do, and I've done the math on this, basically what they're doing is by raising the age limit, they means they get the guaranteed the 4-year contract is, instead of being like that 19-year-old is a bad year, they're moving everything to guarantee that they're getting the most productive years from the players under a price fixed contract. So I mean, it's almost like that's how it kind of works. So, and again, you make a great point, which is the point I make. There's nothing to force you to give a guy a contract or to draft a guy or to bring a guy on your team. Other than the fact, I mean, if you run a stupid team and you pick the wrong guys, then that's on you, and you give them back contract. You can't really blame the players for that. You've created the system which basically puts you on a fixed contract and makes you make the bad draft. But this is not the player's fault, right? It's the I don't know if you watched the Steve Nash series where he kind of says that it's like I'm getting paid next year and I need the money, so I'm not going to retire. So I mean that's entirely, he signed a contract. He's going to show up to play every day. You knew what you were getting when you signed him. I mean, he's older, he's injured. That's not the player's fault. That's on the owners basically. And of
course, the same with Kobe. I was going to say, we're about ready to move on to the next topic, but I wanted to end on one note, which is kind of depressing. There was one other legal case that basically was pertinent to this, which was basically medical residents and how they were placed at hospitals for their residency. Was dictated via an algorithm, and basically you can kind of think the NBA draft for medical students, determining where they're going to end up. And they decided to fight this in a court case. And what ended up happening is Congress basically agreed that it was illegal, but but Congress made essentially a loophole that said, no, this is legal, if that makes sense. So this would not be legal, but we're going to make a law that says it's okay.
Which is
and
exactly you just explained the antitrust exception for the NFL and
exactly.
for the NBA.
And so my point for college athletes in legality, because we've been talking about that in the ban, and we've been in the articles, Jonathan, and of course Arturo, you've both been saying this is absurd. Given how much government has its fingers in the NCAA and NBA, with all the stadiums, do you think there's just not a chance that basically Congress comes to the aid of these different areas and keeps the student athlete alive and well?
Well, let me just say quickly, there are currently 3 bills that are at least being bandied about on Capitol Hill relating to expanding college athletes' rights. And I think Jim Dent is a congressman who's sponsoring one of the bills. And so this is definitely getting more attention from Congress than it has in the past. And I do think that there's an opening that there hasn't been before to take these issues more. I don't think anybody's going to pass a law like this tomorrow, but I think these issues are starting to get traction in a way that they haven't before.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with that. I think that, I think some of the stuff that you read about, like the Obama White House has also kind of been very active, and the Justice Department has been very active, kind of pushing for different things, and the whole one-year scholarship argument, and kind of like freeing that up. And why does the NCAA restrict players to force schools to only give 1-year non-guaranteed scholarships, which is kind of a whole kind of, you go to school, but if you don't like you, or if we change coaches, then you're hosed, you can't graduate. So there's some interesting things that are out there. I think what's more frightening, or I think what's more interesting going down, is kind of the stuff that Dave was helping with the Northwestern students, and the possibility, what happens if, in the middle of a tournament, just 2 teams decide not to play, kind of what happened with the NBA All-Star Game way back when, which is what got them benefits and got the players union for the NBA started. I mean, if the 2 teams in the national championship game decided not to play, so what are you going to do? I mean, what are you going to do? Not pay them? I mean, it's like I think it's a really interesting kind of discussion, and I think at the point where where the change is going to come is when the students actually take ownership of what they do. I mean, if the students decide to kind of stage sit down, or like move in that direction, I think that's what's going to move things.
That is fascinating, by the way, to think, like, if you could just convincing all the schools would be impossible, but if somehow you could, a week before the tournament, right, because they take a break, convince the final 4 teams to basically hold out, that would be, and imagine what it would do to everybody's bracket. The entire nation would go insane based on their brackets.
And I think it was in 1995, a handful of teams who had made the NCAA tournament had agreed that they were going to walk to center court and sit down at the start of the game. And they didn't get there. What was that?
I remember the story, and the NCAA were thankful that nobody got there.
Well, I mean, a couple of these teams did make it, and they were discussing this and planning it, and they basically backed out at the last minute. They just sort of got cold feet. But this was a this was a serious initiative that looked like it was actually going to happen, and then it didn't materialize.
Yeah, I think the other thing
I've taken us way over on this. Sorry with that last thing. I'll let you finish, and then we'll go to the next one, Arturo. Sorry.
I think the other thing that could drive change, and this is going to sound kind of morbid, but if we had a fatality in a major college game, in a major college football game, if a player died, or a player had a catastrophic injury, and it was a situation where his family wouldn't get compensated, this is the kind of thing, with the climate that we have now, with the whole concussion thing, that could really kind of drive change. A tragedy sells papers and dries eyeballs and drives change. And I hate saying that, but I think it's a reality. Much like when Benny Paret died in that kind of took boxing off TV.
Well, that's a somber note to end that segment on. The next one, this is actually what started this. So last week, when you and I were talking, Arturo, basically you made the very astute observation. I don't think it's anything new, by the way, out there, but essentially we have four major sports in the United States. Sorry, soccer, you're not there yet. But basically we have football, baseball, basketball, and hockey are the four major sports that pay lots of money in this country. Two of them, if you're a young player that wants to get money, it's not going to necessarily be great money. A great documentary is The Dotted Line, which basically points out the average minor league baseball player doesn't get paid as well as, an elementary school teacher. But, if you want to get paid as a young player, as a baseball player or hockey player, you can. Devin Dignam, who doesn't like hockey but is our resident Canadian on the Boxscore Geeks, brought up John Tavares, who basically tried to get into the NHL at age 16. He didn't succeed, but that's the point. At age 16, he was trying to get into the NHL, and it was seriously considered. In baseball, obviously, you can be super young and play. We actually have the other thing where, players are pretending to be older than they are, we think. But, we basically, the two predominantly African-American sports in this country involve, forced playing for free, and the NBA is actually looking to push that up. And so, let's see. I was going to say, Arturo, I'll let you start us off because you were the one who brought that topic up last week.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things that, like, you hate pointing out in polite society sometimes, but you kind of have to, in the sense of, like, it's kind of interesting that the two sports that are, like, majorly, like, where the systems are composed majorly of young black males, and these are the ones who are being said, like, no, you need to do this. We're not going to pay you, and it's going to make you better. Going to college is going to make you a better person, so we don't need to pay you for that. It's a very kind of, I mean, I think the plantation mindset that's there, and given the situation, given the amount of kind of damage, particularly football players take, it's kind of really, I'd say it's really, really kind of unethical. I mean, it's almost kind of where you're setting up a system where, like, you're exploiting these young men, and it's not something that would be like, I only think that it's the society allows it, or society has been so kind of lenient to it because of kind of the people who are being exploited. I mean, sadly, I think if it was all young white males, then I think it might be a different story, or I think society might be quicker to change. And it's something that's sad to kind of say, but I mean, I'm Hispanic myself, so I feel kind of I can point this out and say, look, it's kind of strange that, there's always this kind of the division between, you've got the media and you've got how they talk about football players, and sometimes the culture of the football teams and the basketball team is a little shocking. It's a different culture than what, like, the guys who are writing about it are used to.
And Jonathan, like, something we brought up, because, like, these other two systems have minor league teams, and the D League keeps getting counted. The D League still has many of the same problems, same issues where, the D League, as you pointed out to me when we first started discussing this, has an age restriction. So even if we're trying to tout all of the minor league systems for these sports, which, like I said, it seem to target young black males, still seem to have this really weird tone to them. And I think, would you agree with that, or anything to add to that?
Well, I mean, I just, I mean, there's no doubt that there's some kind of paternalism in all of this, but I just wanted to piggyback on what Arturo just said, because I'd written a piece last week about age limits in the NHL, and, NHL.com, which is, of course, the official voice of the NHL, had an article a couple of years ago about the cohort. Every year, 18-year-olds enter the NHL, every year. And NHL.com had an article a couple of years ago talking about how great they were doing in the NHL and how well they were adjusting, and the NHL made sure that they had in place the resources and support systems to make sure that these 18-year-olds had a smooth transition, and that it was all fine. And so I do think that here's the NHL on the one hand saying it's great having 18-year-olds in the league, and on the other hand, the NBA is saying the sky is falling because we have 19-year-olds. You do have to, it does beg the question, why do the two leagues feel so differently about teenagers?
Well, I would say keep in mind that the NBA has also had, like, at least on their stern, there was a whole thing kind of to stamp out. They've always got the Kermit Washington punch in their mind, and how to stamp out that gangster image that the league had, and kind of how to get away from that that young black kind of rap, kind of young, kind of in your face black culture. And I think this is something that the league has tried to do over time with like kind of the dress code and some other things. This is something that David Stern, I mean, he was trying to get the league away from this point to get it more towards the mainstream. And I think, you know, the younger players and the whole kind of, there's at least a perception that, you know, when we had the Allen Iverson NBA, right, when all these 18-year-old players were getting all this money and they were acting kind of, or the perception was they were acting out, this was not something that the NBA kind of this is not what the NBA wanted to put behind. I think again the key moment in that for that is probably the riot at the Palace. I mean, I think that's kind of, you know, David Stern's worst nightmare, and I think that kind of helped drive a lot of this bandwagon. And I think, and again, they're trying to market the NBA to a broader market, and I think they believe that having older players, right, who are more mature, actually reduces the risk and makes them more marketable. I mean, it doesn't mean I agree with it, but I think this is kind of where they're coming at it from.
There's no question. And I mean, the dress code was imposed in the fall of 2005. That was in direct response to the Malice in the Palace, which had taken place the previous November. And David Stern, you know, whatever else one would say about him, we know he's a bright guy. He has been explicit that, look, we are selling our product to a predominantly white audience, and therefore we have to be especially concerned and sensitive to the fact that the majority of our players are young African-American men. I mean, he has not hid the fact that that is a major consideration in all of this.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely troubling. And oh, by the way, and I apologize, Jonathan, because I have you on my RSS feed, but the article you're discussing is on the 7th, the NHL and age limits. So yeah, I just got a chance to look that over. But yeah, that is remarkable. And what I actually like about that in response to kind of when we're talking the racial element is what you're saying about like young white players. There is this very weird sense in talking about young black males that, well, they're not ready. And I think that's that. I hadn't realized that about the NHL. How interesting it was that you were basically saying the opposite. How they were applauding these young people for being so mature. Dwight Howard pulled his team to the NBA Finals. That should to anybody that bashes Dwight Howard in 2009 is the reason that team made the NBA Finals. That was not a good team. Anybody
who bashes Dwight Howard is insane, because here's the thing. I watched the whole process with the Lakers. He was respectful. He went out and interviewed with every single one of the teams. He went on a visit. Before he made this decision, before he announced it publicly, he said, "I'm going to sit down with the Lakers." And this is what he did. He went and talked to them face to face, told them what he was going to do very politely, and then he announced what he was going to do. I didn't see anything wrong with that process. It should also
be noted that he didn't play as well at the Lakers, but he was injured. And I mean, towards the end of the season, he picked it up, but it was too late by that point.
And again, if I was Dwight Howard in that situation, and like the Lakers are like, no, you know, Kobe's still a star. We're gonna give him all this money, and it's still gonna work. You kind of say, look, you're crazy. I'm gonna walk away, and I can't blame him for doing something that I would have done in that situation, because, you know, I want to win a title, and what you're doing is not gonna win a title.
Well, let me point out one other thing here. The two most controversial free agencies, you two can correct me if I'm wrong, of the last decade in the NBA are LeBron and Dwight Howard. And we can talk about whether LeBron should have done that ESPN show or whatever, but what I think is interesting about both those cases is, for all the talk about greedy athletes and all they care about money, blah, 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 in each case, LeBron and Dwight Howard walked away from something like $30 million to go sign for another team, because what did they want to do? They actually wanted to be in a place where they could more likely win. And so that's another narrative that we hear about the modern athlete in general all the time. They're greedy. They just care about money. And here are two guys who, look, they're not in the poorhouse, but that's a lot of money that they each walked away from.
And you don't hear about this in baseball. In baseball, everybody just takes the highest salary, and this doesn't happen. You don't hear this narrative. But I mean, the other thing about that is, you know, LeBron and Dwight both went to play with guys they liked. Yes. I mean, everything I heard at the Sloan Conference was like Dwight and and Chandler Parsons and Harden, they're boys. They like each other. They enjoy the city they're living in. He went to, I'm going to play with my friends. I'm going to play in a better situation with a smarter team. And I'm going to play in a city that I like, where I don't have an issue, which is a better fit, which is Houston. I think for LeBron, I mean, it's a no-brainer going from Cleveland to Miami in terms of situation. The guys I'm playing with, it's a better, much smarter organization. History has borne that out. And he's playing in South Beach. I mean, and he took, like I said, he took less money to achieve his goal. So I mean, there's a component that, you know, it's almost like, who does he think he is? Who does? And I'm not going to add the pejorative I should add at the end, but you can imagine what the pejorative I think is there. And people can say like, no, that's not what I'm doing that. But there is that, and there is that. If you hear somebody like, I'm not a fan of Skip Bayless, but everything in that, it kind of he actually annoys me. And a lot of his ranting, right, has to me an undertone of, you know, he's going at him, you know, because of who he is, right? And I think that's a bit troubling. I mean, I think that colors why this issue is kind of festered, which is like, you know, we're saying that, you know, the college athletes in basketball and football should be happy for the opportunity, right? You know, they should be happy. They have room and board, you know, and we give them room and board, and we give them the opportunity for experience. And I was telling somebody on Twitter, basically, you know, slaves and indentured servants had the same thing. And yeah, they got room and board, they got that, but they're being exploited, and you can't kind of.
So I think you're actually giving a perfect segue to our last segment, but also tying it to this one. The definitive work on this subject, and Mosey Platt's the person who first brought it up, and I apologize, it took me years to finally read it, but it's an amazing book called $40 Million Slaves, by William C. Roden. He is on Twitter, and you should follow him if you are not. But this fantastic book that brings up history, the racial component, kind of some warnings. For instance, if you look at jockeys and horse racing, jockeys used to be predominantly African American. Same idea. There were myths basically about athleticism for certain things, and you know, basically, as soon as money got brought in, things got very weird. But to your point about feeling lucky on this, and we're going to talk paying athletes. That's the very last part. Tying this all together is, you know, why should we pay these athletes? This thing that keeps coming up. Dave Barry has been all over the place about this, but in $40 Million Slaves, he kind of brings up this idea that, you know, they're exploited very quickly. Young athletes are exploited very quickly for things as easy as a pair of shoes or a meal, if you're basically targeting poor demographics, you know, people without money. And that, again, has the very odd, you know, tinge to it, the very racial component of targeting specific people for this. And then as to your saying, Arturo, the weird note that comes to it, well, they should feel lucky, right? They should feel lucky that I'm giving them a meal and shoes and an education. Why should they dare ask for money? And that brings us back to this final point, which is, I believe we called it pay to play, I believe. But, you know, shouldn't we be paying these? I think we all agree, and that's. I think we can easily end the podcast out on that subject.
Well, let me. One point I want to make here. I think one reason, you know, that issue that Dre and Arturo, you're both bringing up about when people say these college athletes should be grateful. You know, what I think makes it this enterprise, part of what makes it so powerful, is that for many of these kids who came from nothing, a full ride to UNC or Michigan or Alabama or Stanford or wherever, it is an incredible thing for them. And so, and I think that's part of what gives this enterprise its kind of resonance, is that is an amazing day. I don't know if either of you guys ever watched the show Friday Night Lights, but there's a scene in Friday Night Lights when Michael B. Jordan starts getting letters from LSU and Michigan and whatever, and he comes home and he shares them with his mom, and they're hugging and crying because it means he might actually have a future. And so I do think that you know, that backdrop gives real power. I mean, look, I think the NCAA they're a bunch of hypocrites and they're full of it in all sorts of ways, but what they have going for them is that a lot of these guys coming into their ranks, it is a miracle for them that they're getting this opportunity and the scholarship, et cetera. And it makes the battle, the legal arguments and the arguments about pay and employment, it just makes it that much more of an uphill battle.
Yeah, I think And again, I think the problem with, and I mean, I agree with the story, and I agree with that's the element that's there. I think what happens is over time, as the amount of money being talked about has gone up and up and up and up and up and just keeps going up, and it looks
Yeah,
like it's not going to stop, then it
yeah,
really starts becoming a kind of a more unsustainable argument, because it's one thing when like they're selling football games for $1 million a year. That's a football package, I believe, in 1950.
yeah.
But when the tournament's being sold at about $1 billion, I think this contract is going to end at like $1 billion a year for the tournament games. That you start kind of thinking, and when the NCAA is spending $1 million on private planes in a year, you start kind of going, well, it does get kind of silly at this point, and there's that benefit. But I mean, again, here's the thing. There's a long, and I was going to make this point. There is a long-standing tradition in this country of paying college athletes, right? They paid them in Texas. They paid them in multiple schools. They're probably still paying them different places. Boosters will pay them. There is money to be made, and there's money to be paid. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be the schools. It's because they wanted to put these restrictions to make it fair and to make it fair for all the schools, that they decided to let's not pay the players. But again, if you start looking at this, let's look at soccer. There are teams in soccer, the powerhouse teams in world soccer, who have more money and more wherewithal than other teams. So Man United can afford to pay more than anybody else for a player. Barcelona can do the same thing, so can Real, and it doesn't make for necessarily a bad product, right? You have these top teams that can pay more, you have these teams that act as feeder systems. So if the argument against paying really is because, it's going to make it so that it's an unlevel playing field, well, that's not really the athlete's problem. I mean, why do we have to, why can't you have these schools kind of get their boosters kind of pay for the players? Again, here's the thing. It wouldn't even be public money. You could probably get the alumni associations. I'm sure the Kentucky Alumni Association would be willing to pony up and pay these players. We know the Texas schools would. We know all these schools would. And like Steve Spurrier kind of said, I'll pay these players out of my own pocket if you let me. And so all the SEC schools have said the same, basically.
And Arturo, I just want to add one thing to that argument about competitive balance, which is what the masters of all sports always invoke when they want to keep a bigger share of the pie for themselves. Yeah. It's always a self-serving argument. But in the case of college football, I mean, has anybody else noticed Alabama won 3 national championships in 4 years? Are we ever talking about more than, 6 or 10 schools a year who have a real shot at winning the national championship? I mean, we are already in a situation where college football is an oligopoly.
It's really interesting.
I think it's really overstated when people say it's going to destroy competitive balance if players start getting played. We already have competitive imbalance in college football, and it's going to continue regardless of whether we pay the players.
I believe the SEC has won. Did they win this? No, they didn't win this year. Basically, they've been in the national championship game
They had won 7 years in a row before this.
Yeah, 7 years before. And then they made the championship game this year. And I think it's interesting that it's the conference that is in the region of the country that traditionally paid their athletes, right? So I would suspect that playing for Alabama football means that you probably you have a very low cost of living, let's say, in the state of Alabama. Probably now, and probably for a good, particularly if you're on a national championship team, I think you eat and you drink for free a significant amount for the rest of your life too. So there is compensation happening. I mean, or there are mechanisms for compensation happening, and I think it's kind of. And again, here's the thing: the SEC is not even lying to you about it. The SEC is saying, look, we'd be willing to pay. We want to pay our athletes. Let us pay our athletes. I think actually, and I think I made the point that a tragic injury could do it. I think the other thing it could do is the SEC might get to a point and say, look, we're gonna screw the NCAA. We're gonna go off, form our own league, and we're gonna pay our athletes. And we're going to get a massive TV contract, which they would get a massive TV contract on their own. They could go ahead and do that. I mean, there's precedent for this kind of thing. The Premier League I mentioned in Europe, in England, where the Premier League used to be the championship, and the top team said, you know what, screw the Football Association. We're going to sign our own contracts because we can make more money. And I think that is a real possibility, particularly with the super conferences that are currently happening. All these conferences they're consolidating. If the SEC gets a 24-team league, what's stopping them from going off on their own and turning themselves into a pro league? Associated with schools.
In fact, I mean, the Power 5 conferences, right? The Big 12, the Pac 12, the Big Ten, the ACC, the SEC, there is more and more talk that the 5 of them will in fact break off from the NCAA, form their own entity, and I think, as you say, Arturo, they'd be much more open to paying players than the current structure allows.
Yeah, once the money starts rolling in from the playoff, and I don't know if we mentioned this, but I think the playoff system for the football schools scares the crap out of the NCAA, because if the schools can actually run the tournament and make money, and they're going to, then why do they need the NCAA to run their basketball tournament for them? But so the schools could just say, look, we're the power conferences, we're going to run this tournament, we're going to run a separate basketball tournament, and we're not going to abide to the NCAA rules, and we're going to pay our players, and we're going to compensate them. And you can go off and have a cute Division 1A, like it'll be like, you have a Division 1 AA or 1A, and you have the power conferences basically are pro, and that could very realistically happen. And if you're a power conference and you're making this much money, you start looking at the landscape and saying, we could pay the athletes and make even more money, and we don't have to deal with all the stupid NCAA rules. And I think that's, I mean, if I'm pulling out a crystal ball and forecasting what's going to happen, I think that's where we're headed. I mean, these schools, as I said.
But Drake, can I just jump in and say,
go for it.
To your, at the beginning of the segment, talking about pay for play, I think in the meantime, and, the O'Bannon lawsuit is really about this, even if the schools don't themselves pay anything, the idea that the players can't get compensated for their own likeness or their own image. I mean, talk about something that's reached such a point of absurdity that, even on ESPN, which, in many ways is a mouthpiece for college athletics, you won't really find anybody or many people on that network who will defend that proposition anymore, right? I mean, Jay Billis has become, has just been openly mocking and exposing the absurdity of that. And so that, I think, is much closer to happening than anything else. The jersey sales, selling autographs on your own time, which, again, it doesn't cost the schools a dime.
Yeah. To me, it's absurd that I think I brought up that, first off, I can make money on March Madness right now. I can go fill out a bracket. It can win. I think legally, if Warren Buffett wants to give me $1 billion, that counts.
Right.
So, but if you win March Madness, which is arguably much harder than me filling out a bracket and guessing, because that's what you have to do to win, they can't make any money. And then also, I could wear a jersey, go to a game, get a player to sign it, hit eBay and sell it. No problem with that. The athlete can't do that. That's, to me, is the height of absurdity.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key points, is the fact that that is one of the things that they really have to change. And again, this is, I think.
What I was going to actually say, because I wanted to, because we're hitting the end, and there was one subject I actually did want to talk to you a bunch about, Jonathan, before we ended, because we're close to 45 minutes, was you and Arturo, this entire segment, have basically been talking about how the NCAA could change to pay players. These players are, 18. Are you allowed to be 17 and play in the NCAA? Could you have a 17-year-old college player play freshman ball legally in the NCAA?
I don't think there's a rule against that.
I was 17 and playing. I wasn't playing basketball or football, but I was playing college athletics when I was 17.
Yeah, I don't think there's a rule against that.
So in theory, you guys are both talking about, well, we could make these different leagues. They could compete. So, okay, that you're basically saying we could pay these young players who are 18 or 19 years old. The other discussion that's kind of been in place about paying players or paying them to be professional, because that's what all the major leagues are, which you got into an argument with Mark Cuban about, is the age and maturity. And so I'm very interested in your take here, because your stance this entire segment has been, we can pay these young players to play. The problem isn't that they're not professional. The problem is we're not paying them. So what are your thoughts on the fact that Adam Silver at Sloan made it basically his vision that in the future the NBA would not allow players in until they were 20 years old?
I mean, one thing I'm actually curious as to, I know we're running out of time here, and maybe this is for future discussion, but well, first of all, obviously I disagree with Adam Silver, but clearly the owners have decided that it's bad for their product to let in younger players. I thought one interesting thing that Mark Cuban made in the comments to one of the pieces I wrote about age limits is when he said, you're not fielding phone calls from agents who are worried about their 18-year-old players who don't know how to handle their money, or this, that, the other thing. So I think part of what's going on is just anecdotally, they're getting these horror stories about 18-year-olds making bad adjustments to the NBA. But I think part of what I'm frustrated by in this discussion is that at no point have they provided systematic data to back up their arguments. There are guys who spent 4 years in college and came into the NBA and still blew all their money or got arrested or whatever. And so I just haven't seen them make any kind of concrete data-driven argument about why 18-year-olds. We know 18-year-olds on average are less mature than 21-year-olds. We also know that most 18-year-olds are not going to try to make this leap. And so I just come back to my frustration about the way that they frame these issues.
Yeah, one point out, and it's an anecdote, which is, what if you all had a 14-year-old who was one of the top 10 soccer prospects in the world? What would happen to that 14-year-old? The real chance is somebody like Real or Barca or like a big soccer team in Europe would come and say, look, we're going to sign him, we're going to put him in our youth academy, and we're going to train this kid up, and we're going to teach him basically everything to turn him into a professional player. And this includes, like, we're going to teach him, we're going to give him tutors, we're going to train him, we're going to get him to the point where he's ready to play on our squad. And we're going to turn him into a kind of a soccer professional, right? Okay. And I think kind of the way the system is structured, if you went to the path where you're saying, like, you're going to have power conference are going to pay for players, right, then you kind of put the onus on that. But, if for example, you're Texas, then it behooves you to kind of take this person and turn him, if I'm paying him, I'm going to turn him into an appropriate or a professional, right? And I think by having the system we have now and having the restrictions we have now, really, I think I do think there's a bit of a frustration from some of these power schools where they can't do what they want with the players. So they're limited in what they can do and how they can help these players and how they can make their lives better. And you hear all these stories about, these coaches do actually care about their players and do actually want to do right by them. And sometimes where they get into trouble is like the restrictions don't let them. I do think that whatever change comes, right, I think should move towards the path where, like, there's a more structured approach to getting these players ready for the possibility of playing professional ball. And I think right now there is no approach. Basically, you have to either learn on your own or fall on your ass. And I think that's what ends up happening. I mean, that's why we have these guys who are not ready, because nobody sat down and actually made them ready.
Well, and Arturo, just one more quick point on that. We really haven't touched on it at all, but you made a reference to the constraints on college programs and trying to train the players in the way they want to. Constraint number one is, and it's not a fiction for all of them, but it's a fiction for a lot of them, that they have to be students who go to classes and spend a ton of time trying to do schoolwork that many of them don't want to do, and it's not really what they're there for. And again, I think for those who want that education and want to take advantage of that would be great. But for those who don't, I think that the future, in part, is just going to have to be much more flexible about that piece of it. Because when it's not, that's when we start getting all these academic scandals like the one we've had here at UNC, where you're basically, and the documentary Schooled really gets into, where you're creating parallel curricula because you have to maintain this fiction about why some of these athletes are at these schools.
Yeah, I think the point I was also making, and down that path, is, if you have that and you don't have that fiction anymore, you can basically kind of if you turn it into a free market approach, then it is to the college's advantage to say, look, here's our football team, and these are the guys who've actually gone through our program, and look how successful they are.
Yes.
Because we individually tailored everything. We said, like, maybe it's not classes. Maybe we have a guy who's, like, reading at a 7th grade level. Well, we put a program in place. We spend money on tutors. We have kind of a development program, and say maybe there's a school out there that says, you know what, I'm going to take all these guys who are like 7th or 8th grade level, and I'm going to create a program where I train them up and I bring them up to this level, and I sell it as competitive advantage. I say, look, you have these guys, come to our program, we will turn you into effective adults, right? And I think that's a competitive advantage to market if you're like a great football player choosing between schools, and if I go to this school, there's an advantage to me because they've tailored the program to me. And I think that's kind of, again,
To get one more pot shot in on the NCAA, is the book The Blind Side, not the movie, but in the book they basically bring up Michael Oher was so far behind. Basically, they got an exclusion for him, claiming him mentally handicapped because he was or mentally disabled. Sorry, mentally disabled because his IQ had been so low, and it had changed in such a short period of time. It was actually the irony is the NCAA was actually working against them, where they said if your GPA is not at this level, you cannot play college ball. Obviously, if he doesn't play college ball, he doesn't get to the NFL. They were actually working against him because there was this family saying, we're going to develop him, we're going to get him private tutors, we're going to teach him, we're going to get his GPA up. The NCAA was actually working against him, whereas like what you're talking about, Arturo, sounds great, which is you could actually mature players. And our current system actually is against that. The exact thing you just brought up, the NCAA has actively opposed. But on that, I was going to say, so we've hit about time, and this is a long subject. I know we could go all night, and I would love us to, but I would actually prefer to keep this short and then just promise that. So, Jonathan, I'll see if I can trick you on the show. Definitely be open to having you back. Are you interested in talking more about this?
I would love to come back anytime. Yeah.
And so if you're not already reading, it's theespnwatch.wordpress.com, and you are John Weiler on Twitter, at John Weiler. You with Kevin Draper of the Dis are two of my favorite writers on the subject, just so it's clear.
Thanks.
So
I appreciate that.
Everybody should be following this. But I was just curious, as a teaser for future podcasts, what's a subject you would like to tease that you would like to talk about in the future? And we'll end on that. I'll ask Arturo the same and then sound us off.
I would love to talk on a future subject. I'm sure you guys have talked about it before, but the ongoing misanalysis of Carmelo Anthony as a Knicks fan is a source of endless. Well, and Dre, of course, as a Nuggets fan, you can empathize, but that's certainly one topic that would be fun to talk about in the future.
Oh, I would love that.
He is sadly the best Puerto Rican player ever to play in the NBA, but that's not.
That's just because Ronaldo Balkman will never get back in for choking someone. Anyway,
true.
And what's
in the Philippines?
Anything you would like to end on, Arturo?
I think I think following the subject, I think I'd really like to take a stab at kind of talking about, what would a minor league basketball, maybe even football system look like? If we could run it, what would we propose? What would we do? I think it's an interesting kind of exercise, and I think it's something that is right now. I think we're imagining what it could be, but I do think it's actually going to come into play within the next 10 or 15 years. I do think the NCAA, it's one of these things. It's like I don't feel like football is going to exist in the form it exists now in 20 years, and I don't think that the NCAA is going to exist in the form that exists now, even if it does exist in 20 years either. So I do think it's going to start becoming something interesting going down the path.
Awesome. And just as a teaser, we talked to Patrick Minton before this one, so the original NBA geek will be on next week's podcast. We'll have to think of a subject next time, Jonathan, when you're on. I don't care what the subject is. I'm going to devote at least 10 minutes to bashing Melo. Critically analyzing Melo. How's that?
Yeah. He is having the best season of his career.
Without a doubt. Yes.
And he's still not worth the money. He is never.
It's going to be interesting to see what happens when we put him in the triangle. That's going to be interesting.
The history of his contract, he has never been worth his pay. I just want to throw that out there. Yeah. He's never had 1 year he's been worth his pay. Yeah. Sorry. I shouldn't have let us open this can of worms. So thank you so much for joining us on this Box Score Geeks, and we will see you next time.